here at the Action Fund, and I'm thrilled to be here talking to you about the importance of transparency and long-termism with such incredible coalition partners. Ceres, the FACT Coalition, the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, Public Citizen, the AFL-CIO, US CIF, Patriotic Millionaires, and Americans for Financial Reform. Today's event brings together all of our organizations to focus on why expanding disclosure matters for investors and for building a sustainable, long-term oriented economy. So thank you to everyone who has worked so hard to make it happen. And thank you all for joining us. Capital markets serve an essential role in enabling economic growth. They connect investors looking to earn returns with companies wanting capital to spur business growth. But since the days of the stock market crash of 1929, we have known that to work effectively, capital markets need transparency. For more than 80 years, the SEC has provided the transparency these markets need. But many of the rules governing corporate disclosure haven't been updated in decades, and our world has changed a lot. It is increasingly clear that the old, traditional financial indicators tell an incomplete story. The joint report that today's coalition released shows that investors are increasingly demanding a wide range of quantitative and qualitative metrics and narratives, and that this information is essential to get the full picture of a company. From climate change to human rights, tax strategies to political spending, workforce issues to financial stability risks, the common thread uniting these environmental, social, and governance, or ESG's topics, is their long-term impacts on investors, the company, and our economy. More broadly, these issues affect our economy and the middle class. 2 weeks ago, our sister institution, the Center for American Progress, put out a big middle-class roadmap called Raising Wages and Rebuilding Wealth. Among many proposals, CAP called for strategies to reduce corporate short-termism and boost productivity, enhancing investments for the long term. CAP also called for boosting households' ability to save for retirement. With trillions of middle-class retirement dollars invested in our markets, today's conversation is at the heart of all of these issues. But not everyone thinks transparency is the best path forward. In fact, congressional Republicans have done everything in their power not only to block new disclosure requirements and repeal the Dodd-Frank Act, but also to eliminate many disclosures on the false grounds of disclosure overload. Whether it's a company's political activity or a presidential nominee's tax returns, too many Republicans seem to abide by the motto, the less people know, the better. That kind of mindset is dangerous for our economy and a disservice to the American people. And that's what makes today's conversation so important. To kick off the conversation, I couldn't think of anyone better suited than Senator Jeff Merkley. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008 from Oregon, Senator Merkley has, in fairly short time, been at the center of so many of the public policy issues we're discussing today. He led a coalition of 44 senators pushing the SEC to require public companies to disclose political spending. He has been a prominent advocate for bold change on climate change as well. From his perch on the Senate Banking Committee, he authored the Volcker Rule in Dodd-Frank, took on payday lending, proposed ways to reduce corporate short-termism, and introduced CAP's TSP for All retirement security proposal. Senator Merkley has never been one to gloat or hog the spotlight, unlike a certain presidential candidate I know, so his leadership sometimes slips under the radar. But few can match his record for serious proposals and actual legislative accomplishments in building an economy that works for the middle class and those struggling to join it. Today, by showing that smartly regulated financial markets can support the long-term interests of investors, businesses, and the economy, this event really brings together the diverse aspects of his leadership. We know he has to rush off to a big hearing on Wells Fargo. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Jeff Merkley.
Winnie, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the Center for American Progress for hosting today, and for all the groups that Winnie mentioned that have helped to organize this particular forum. I don't think you could have picked a better day to hold a discussion about the importance of transparency. We're hearing a lot in the presidential campaign about transparency. We're hearing about health records transparency. We're hearing about tax disclosure. And occasionally we even hear a little bit about disclosure and accountability in the financial markets. When I leave here, as Winnie mentioned, I'll be going to the Senate Banking Committee to attend a hearing on Wells Fargo. So this is a little bit of a warm-up for that. If you all have any questions you want me to ask, please feel free to hand them to me on the way out. It is kind of incredible. We're not talking about 5 or 50 employees being fired, or 500, but more than 5,000. And about the manager of the unit who oversaw this over many years while employees were being fired for creating fake credit card accounts and bank accounts. The manager walks away with more than $100 million, platinum parachute. Doesn't that just kind of shock the conscience? And it kind of reminds us about the great divide between people working in America, often at minimum wage, struggling to get by, and the type of compensation at the very top, and driving the inequality in America. But that's not our topic for today. What is our topic is the current system of financial disclosures isn't working well. Our nation was brought to the brink of economic collapse because of shady dealings and lack of accountability in our financial regulatory system. And although we worked to pass major reforms with the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, it's clear that people's memories are fairly short, and resistance is certainly high. There are those who refuse to learn the lessons of the financial crisis and are still working to make a quick profit, no matter the cost to society. And what happened at Wells Fargo only highlights the failure of the Securities and Exchange Commission to do its job, to enforce internal control requirements of public companies and keep them accountable. During the Enron scandal, the CEO, Ken Lay, claimed he just didn't have knowledge of the fraud being conducted at his company. In response, Sarbanes-Oxley was enacted and created a series of internal control disclosures that are meant to reduce corporate fraud and protect investors, inform investors. And CEOs now have to sign off on their company's financial and accountability reporting. So with all of what happened at Wells Fargo, with more than 5,000 employees being fired over that 5-year period, how is it that the CEO, John Stumpf, signed off and certified the accuracy of the bank's financial and accountability statements, and those statements didn't touch on this topic? How is it possible the CEO did not know what was going on? And the American people are curious about answers, and both the House and the Senate are going to be looking at that. But we need more than congressional hearings. It's clear that we need to address these issues that reverberate across the financial sector. Did Wells Fargo willfully turn a blind eye because it was simply the cost of doing business? Did they fail in their legal responsibilities to oversee their operations, to catch and stamp out fraud? Either way, the SEC, as well as Congress, should be taking a very close look at this and demanding accountability for these egregious failures. But let's look towards the future. Current circumstances, one story after another, show why the SEC needs to mandate a set of uniform disclosures that address the size, complexity, and individual management accountability of these institutions. We need to ensure that they are not too big to fail, not too big to manage, not too big to jail. Disclosures make our capital markets the best in the world. They're a powerful tool for investors to be able to reward a company or to influence change when they see that company heading down a path they don't agree with, or to influence change. In short, disclosures hold banks and companies accountable. As Justice Brandeis once remarked, sunlight is the best of disinfectants. But there's another reason we need greater transparency. Owners want to know what their companies are doing and who they're doing it with. And I'm not just talking about disclosing a company's earnings or spending. I'm talking about non-financial information that affects a company's current performance, future performance, and the public interest. Owners want to know what kind of carbon footprint a company has. They want to know which political candidates a company is donating to. They want to ensure that at no point in a company's supply chain are suppliers violating their employees' human rights. Investors want this information because they care about the conduct of the companies they invest in. They certainly care about their investments making money, but they also care about their impact on the world, which can be relevant to profits and losses over the long term. Trillium Asset Management is a great example of a firm using its investment power for social change. Cheryl Smith on our panel today will talk a little bit about it when she is up here in a few minutes. And just shortly mention, at J.B. Hunt's annual June meeting, Trillium presented a shareholder proposal to add sexual orientation and gender identity to the company's equal employment opportunity policy. Good job. Well done. It passed with nearly 55% of the vote, and it makes a meaningful difference. Now 19,000 J.B. Hunt employees across the country are protected under the company's EEO policy, regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation or identity. That's a great example of stockholder owners making a direct impact. And that's the kind of engagement we need to foster, we need to support as we take on challenges like global warming and ensuring long-term economic growth. And to do that, we need greater economic, social, and governance disclosures. Unfortunately, as it stands now, most of these disclosures are voluntary. Makes it difficult for investors to make clear and informed decisions about where to put their money. It can lead to confusion about the kinds of activities those companies are engaging in. And let's take, for example, a company spending on political campaigns and lobbying. Investors, and let's recognize that investors as stockholders are current owners, and if they're considering an investment, they're potential owners. They want that information because it is relevant to their calculation of future profits. But in addition, it is critical information relevant to whether they want to be an owner. And it's often said that, well, if they don't like what a company is doing, there's an easy off-ramp. They can sell their stock. But you can't exercise that option if you don't have the information on which to base the decision. That's why the SEC needs to require mandatory, uniform disclosures from public companies, from their political spending to their carbon footprints to their supply chains, and for financial institutions, disclosing exactly the type of information I was talking about at the beginning. How megabanks are managing the risks and complexities of housing a large array of financial services in one company. These type of reforms are not over the horizon, flights of fancy. They're not impossible. The fact is the SEC already has the power it needs to require these mandatory disclosures. It has the ability and authority to demand far more of our largest corporations than it is asking for now. It simply has chosen not to. And I'm disappointed that after all the work it took to get our nation back on its feet following the Great Recession, the SEC, under the leadership of Mary Jo White, has been singularly uninterested in using its authority to secure transparency and accountability. Chair White has failed to exercise appropriate oversight, and she has slow-walked reforms required by law. The SEC took almost 3.5 years to complete the Volcker Rule, reining in the Wall Street casino. Or take another example. Senator Levin and I championed a provision to prevent banks from betting on the value of the securities they create. You might remember how this worked. They developed securities. They knew what was in those securities, and they tucked in a lot of bad stuff. They sold it as the best thing since sliced bread to investors, and then they took bets that it would collapse and drop in value. This is an egregious form of insider trading. But the SEC under Mary Jo White has failed to complete the rule necessary to implement this provision. It's over 2,100 days. It's 6 years. It's unacceptable, and it's wrong. And it underscores why our next SEC chair must be a proven reformer, not another defender of Wall Street who resists disclosure and accountability. A reformer who will push through strong disclosure requirements, who will reform rules or enforce rules that are already on the book to hold our biggest companies and those who lead them accountable, and institute reforms that are already required, statutorily required under law. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Senate Banking Committee to make sure we have someone in this key position who will embrace this opportunity and use that powerful disinfectant of sunshine to make our markets stronger and more transparent. So thank you, Center for American Progress, for inviting me to come and share a few thoughts this morning about the direction we need to go, and to work myself up a bit before I go and attend the hearing with Wells Fargo. And I certainly look forward to partnering with many of you in the months ahead to take on these issues. Thank you.
I know the senator is leaving, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that I was lucky enough to have the privilege to work alongside his staff, who's also here in the front row. And it's one of the great privileges I've had in my life to actually see him work. I also worked for a fantastic senator in Senator Carl Levin. And regardless of the politics, he's one of the good ones. And I certainly appreciate his remarks today. I also want to thank CAP Action and the other sponsors and supporters of today's event. And I want to note that today I'm joined by an unprecedented group of investors, coalitions, public interest organizations representing millions of Americans and billions of dollars. These groups, the AFL-CIO, Americans for Financial Reform, Center for American Progress, Series, FACT Coalition, ICAR, Patriotic Millionaires, Public Citizens, USIF, all have one thing in common. They've been working for years to help investors, companies, our country, and our world address our greatest challenges. As the challenges facing our world have risen, so too must the forces need to meet those challenges. With rising sea levels comes an imperative to address climate change, and shareholders have billions of reasons to know how their companies are meeting the challenge. With rising tax avoidance by the largest multinational organizations comes a rising imperative for shareholders to know and the public to know how their companies are or aren't paying their taxes. With millions of corporate dollars flowing into political campaigns comes a pressing need for the owners of those companies to know how their dollars are being spent. And with rising income inequality and the gig economy comes a pressing need to ensure that shareholders understand how their workers are treated, how they're compensated, how their company is actually built for success. Our capitalist system is built on the premise that businesses have to play a key role in addressing hard challenges, but they can't do it alone. Companies, investors, workers, and governments all have key roles to play. But you're not likely to solve a problem you don't know about. And while we know about the enormous challenges we face, we don't really know how companies are addressing them right now. Investors have spent decades filing proxy proposals and begging, cajoling, using any tactic they can for more information. But as companies' disclosures have stretched from dozens of pages to hundreds of pages long, the actual information relayed hasn't gotten all that much better. To be clear, most public companies are voluntarily reporting some information about their so-called ESG efforts right now. But those are usually glossy brochures or website hits. They aren't part of their regulatory filings. And frankly, if you see something in the regulatory filings, most of the time it's boilerplate. Oftentimes it's actually the same quarter after quarter after quarter, maybe even for years. But where were Apple's disclosures about its sweetheart deal with Ireland on its taxes? Or what about a company that touts its sustainability efforts to combat climate change while funding climate change deniers? Or to move from just this last month to a few years ago, what about Lehman Brothers or AIG's disclosures about the risks of their derivatives positions? We don't see them. And if they exist at all, they're just notice filings. Certainly not enough for an investor to make an informed valuation decision, not enough for someone to say, look, this is the risk of something bad happening. And oh, by the way, here's the potential magnitude. They don't have enough information to do that. That needs to stop. Some have argued that the issues we're talking about today are just those of special interests. Some have argued that sustainable investing is a fringe thing. Well, here's some real facts. According to US SIF, $6.5 trillion US dollars are being invested. That's $6.5 trillion in making voting decisions or investing decisions on these important factors. But that's just a fraction of the 1,500 of the world's largest investment advisors, by the way, that control more than $60 trillion. So we're talking several times US GDP that have signed on to the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment. Why do all these investors care? They care about these issues because they have to. Improving disclosures isn't about feeling good. It's about smart investing. It's about assessing management risks. It's assessing the risks to the company. It's assessing opportunities. It's about the money. Investors and the public have been demanding more information, and the SEC is obligated to provide them with whatever a reasonable investor deems as important. They're not doing that now. In fact, since taking the helm of the SEC in 2013, Chair White has been leading the financial regulators in the opposite direction. In what she called in a speech in 2013, disclosure overload, she openly expressed concern and worry that investors might be overwhelmed by too much information, that they wouldn't be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, that they wouldn't actually know the important information that they're getting because there would be too much noise. And she worried that companies would be overburdened by their disclosures. So I spend most of my time working on an organization that focuses on algorithmic trading and high-frequency trading. They're worried about it. They're worried about how you can make smart investment decisions. But one of the things I see every day is I see some investors that are making trading decisions based on thousands of bits of data in real time and making split-second decisions, actually split-second decisions. So you're telling me that investors can't process information when they have machines processing information real time, all the time, every day. It's just a ludicrous assumption that investors can't make sense of this information. Yet in 2014, as part of its disclosure effectiveness project, the SEC kicked out a concept release. That's what we're going to talk about today. But they're not alone. The FASB, a self-regulatory organization, by the way, don't get me started on what that actually means. They set the rules for what financial statements have to have. And they're actually doing the same initiative that the SEC is. These disclosure effectiveness initiatives run counter to the plain language of the law. They run counter to what investors are saying they need, that they're telling the FASB, that they're telling the SEC they need, that they're telling companies that they need. And frankly, they're contrary to public policy. As part of this concept release, the SEC is actually asked, gee, what should we do about our disclosures? Now, a concept release, to be clear, is a proposal of a proposal. This one is 340 pages long. It's got more than 300 questions. It's extremely technical stuff. For people like securities lawyer like me, it's great. It's a nice way to lose 2 months of your life to read. But on the other hand, you might forgive the public or securities lawyers or even policy wonks for not paying attention. But the response has been astounding. As of August 16th, there were 26,512 comments. To put that in perspective, since 2008, we had this, financial crisis thing. We had the Dodd-Frank Act. We had the Jobs Act. The SEC has put out over 160 major rules. The 26,512 comments here, they received more comments to this than they received to all but 5 of their major rules. And by the way, most of those others that got the other 5, 4 of them were also about improving disclosures, and the 5th was the Volcker Rule. So those were all interests of investors saying we need more and better protections. The amazing thing is, if you look at the comments, which we all did as part of this report, they fall into two really simple buckets. All of the people who read disclosures saying they want more. A couple of companies, a couple of law firms who work for them, and a couple of trade associations who represent them saying, oh no, the investors are going to be overburdened if you give them all this information, which, by the way, they are asking for. So of the 26,000 letters, over 26,000 of the 26,512 letters, over 26,000 of them say, hey, we need more and better tax disclosures. 10,000 of them say we need more and better climate and environmental disclosures. Nearly 10,000 of them say we need more and better political spending disclosures. And while not part of any sort of broad investor outreach or campaign, more than 40 detailed comment letters say we need to know more about how our companies are investing in human capital. More than 40 detailed comment letters talk about human rights. And 20 detailed, thoughtful comment letters talk about derivatives disclosures. That's not all that shocking if you think about AIG. I understand why an oil and gas company may not be thrilled about expanding their sustainability disclosures or human rights disclosures or political spending disclosures. But a company's reluctance and their executives' reluctance to make these decisions in the face of investors' pleas and in face of the public interest pleas is precisely the reason why rules are needed. And that's what the SEC has heard from investors large and small over and over and over again. From public pension fund trustees to private fund trustees, research analysts, investment advisors, individual and retail investors, the story is always the same. They want more. Since the SEC last significantly updated its disclosure requirements, which by the way was more than 3 decades ago, the world has changed a little bit. And rather than adapt to investors and the public's demands for more and better disclosure, the SEC has continued to substitute its judgment for those of investors. And not only that, it's continued to allow executive management to substitute their judgment for what investors think is important. The law is not that investors are entitled to whatever a reasonable SEC chair thinks is important, nor is it whatever a reasonable CEO thinks is important or a reasonable CFO. It's actually what a reasonable investor thinks is important. Let's do that. Informed and empowered investors are essential to corporate governance. They're essential to long-term economic growth. And they're truly important to a sound economy. But after standing in the way for decades, the SEC is actually now leading the opposition for investors. Today, an unprecedented group of investors and organizations have joined together to host this event and release a joint report demanding that the SEC update its rules to give investors what they need to drive our companies, our country, and our world forward. Again, I want to thank Cap Action and the wonderful organizations today for sponsoring this event and releasing the joint report. Each of these organizations has actually been working on their own efforts. So, for example, the FACT Coalition has worked and released a fantastic tax report, and Public Citizen has released a fantastic report on political spending, and the AFL-CIO has released a fantastic report on workers and human capital, and Center for American Progress has released a report, and I think has more reports outgoing. I'd encourage you to look at those and to see, gee, what are the important issues for investors? We can actually make a significant difference here. And with that, I want to turn things over to my longtime friend, former Senate staffer, and just generally good guy, Andy Green, for what I hope will be a fantastic panel. Thank you.
Have a seat anywhere. Thank you so much. Good morning. So if there wasn't evidence that there's a lot of public interest and investor interest in enhancing disclosure, I'll just hold up the fabulous examples of these reports. There's almost too many. I don't have enough hands and fingers, but we've got the AFL's great report, Fact Coalition, Enhance Taxing Problem for Investors, Public Citizen, showing why corporate political spending is absolutely essential. US CIF's incredible report on the impact of sustainable and responsible investment. I'll come back to this one. Series, great report on reducing systemic risk on climate issues. Our fabulous report authored with Angela Hanks, the lead author on workforce training and long-termism. And ICAR, International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, about SEC and human rights disclosures. And then this joint report, which I encourage everyone to pick up if you haven't already seen it, about Towards a Sustainable Economy. There really is tremendous work and thought that has gone into the coalition and the event that you see here today, and there's going to be more, but I am tremendously pleased to be joined by an all-star panel. Let me introduce them very briefly, and then I'll jump right into questions. So my name is Andy Green. I'm Managing Director for Economic Policy here at Cap Action, and this is a tremendously exciting day. I am joined, and I will start over at the end of the panel with my good friend Morris Pearl, who is a former business executive. Serves now as the chair of Patriotic Millionaires, a group of 200 high net worth individuals who are committed to building a more prosperous, stable, and inclusive nation. But before that, he was managing director of BlackRock, one of the largest investment firms in the world, worked on maiden lane transactions, assessing government's potential losses from bank bailouts, long tenure on Wall Street, working on securitization technology and the capital markets in general. So we're tremendously excited to have you here with us. Angela Hanks is Associate Director for Workforce Development Policy here at Cap Action and CAP. Prior to joining American Progress and Cap Action, Angela was the Senior Federal Policy Analyst to the National Skills Coalition, was a legislative assistant to Representative Elijah Cummings from Maryland, one of my favorite congressmen, and counsel to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Great to have you with us. Cheryl Smith has a tremendous and outstanding record and resume, and so we are thrilled to have you here. PhD economics, managing partner of Trillium Asset Management, which has over $2 billion in assets under management, integrates ESG factors into the investment process to deliver long-term strong performance. But you've also worked with a whole wide range of investors, those who are focused on ESG, but also those who are mainstream and not particularly ESG focused, having served as a past chair of US CIF and as a member of its policy committee. So you've been a leader in this space for many, many years. Thank you for joining us. And Cynthia Williams, a few folks have led the cutting edge of thinking on an academic front on enhancing disclosures on these environmental, social, and governance factors like you have with your landmark law review article in the Harvard Law Review in 1999, continued writing, most recently The Embedded Firm, Corporate Governance, Labor, and Finance Capitalism. You're the professor, the Osler Chair in Business Law at Osgood Hall. You practice law at Cravath and are a member of the EPA's Environmental Finance Board. So thank you, for being with us today, Professor Cindy.
Professor Cindy.
Cindy Williams. Yes. We'll be pretty informal today. So we've heard some really expansive thinking this morning already. I want to start by drilling down into one specific example of how enhancing environmental social governance disclosure can have a real impact in aligning the interests of investors, executives, stakeholders like workers, and the general public interest for the long-term success of our economy. And so I'd like to ask Angela, if you tell us a little bit about the report that you did on workforce training, and really, to me, it seems emblematic of the whole, a great example of all the work we're doing here.
Yeah, I mean, worker training is kind of a really good example of some of the consequences of short-termism. And so this report we put out a couple of months ago, we started with some research based on census data that showed that between 2001 and 2009, like across all companies, there was like a 27% decline in firm-sponsored training, which is kind of it's really significant. And one of the more interesting things about that is the researcher looked at 2001 to 2004 and 2004 to 2009. And you would maybe expect, like, okay, well, in 2007 we had this like major financial collapse, so it's not that unusual that firms would be investing less. But actually, the biggest decline was from 2001 to 2004. So this is something that's independent of the economic cycle. This is something that's just happening, and there's no evidence that it's going to reverse. So one of the reasons why this is a problem is because there's many studies out there that show that not only does training increase wages, it also increases firm and individual worker productivity. So this is a problem as far as firms and workers' economic competitiveness. So we took that problem and looking at it, there were really two things that we identified as the issue. So one, there's this issue of what economists call a multitask problem. And I should add that that research also showed that there is a decline in the large firm advantage to training, so workers are more likely to get trained at large firms, but this isn't happening anymore. And that's something that kind of indicated to us that, you know, we can't say for sure this is what's happening at public companies specifically, but if public companies were to disinvest in their workers, this is what it would look like. So this multitask problem, there's an issue of, you know, basically if managers don't have an incentive to measure something, they're less likely to perform on it. So that creates a challenge where if managers aren't actually looking at their investments in training and in their workers, they're not going to pay as much attention and value those investments in the way that they should. And then the second problem is related to this issue of short-termism, where right now human capital investments are in the same bucket on a financial statement as SG&A. Selling general administrative expenses, which is generally like waste. So you can invest, right, so you can train 1,000 of your workers on the newest technology, and that could be basically on a financial statement be the same as you bought a truckload of paper clips, you bought 10 truckloads of paper clips. To an investor, that's going to show up the same. So if you are a manager and you're focused on cutting that category that's considered waste, you're going to, you know, human capital might be a casualty of that just because you can't demonstrate to investors that you actually have productivity enhancing valuable investments in that category. So, you know, I think human capital is a good example because by requiring some increased disclosure, you remove that disincentive to invest, because now an investor who's looking at a financial statement that actually says, okay, this is how much we invest in our workers. One, they can like look at that investment and decide to value it however they choose. They might say it's bad. I think they'll say it's good, but you could make an argument either way. But then they're also not looking at SG&A. They're getting a better sense of like what your expenditures are outside of SG&A. So it's kind of a good way to put some of this back into perspective.
That's incredible. I mean, just the research that you found that, you know, when investors break out the information, separating paper clips and things that they want to see fewer used from productivity enhancing workforce training, which one would think that would be better for the firm, would be better for investors, would be better for workers, would be better for our overall long-term economy. We'd want to see more of that. Maybe not unlimited, but you'd want to be able to investor to be able to go and ask, hey, how much you doing want to evaluate this? We don't have that broken out, and I think it really shows just an incredible example of how we need to enhance disclosure to empower investors, because clearly the markets are not doing it. Companies can voluntarily do this right now, but they're not. And I think it also goes to show that there's a multi-leveled challenge here where the SEC is involved, but you know, financial statements, those disclosures are handled by FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which Tyler Galosh mentioned this morning, and there's been some very interesting writing on this by a Harvard Business School professor who's gone over to become the dean of the London School of Economics Public Policy School, Karthik Ramana, called Thin Political Markets, where not enough folks are paying attention to these issues and the results are suboptimal. So I think that also highlights the importance of this type of event, where we need investors and everyone to be focused on these issues because the results matter so much for our economy and for our long-term public interest. I'd like to turn to Cheryl quickly, and we can all jump in on all these questions, but I'd like to step back from the very specific example and go to the broad, what you might call the macroeconomic impact. And you're an economist and an investor, and you certainly, I would imagine, look at cash flows, profit margins, all the normal traditional financial measures. Many of these ESG disclosures are non-financial in nature. I think the example we just gave was a financial one, but many of them are not. Greenhouse gas emissions, political spending, I guess could go either way. It's a monetary issue. But how do you see these? How do you see investors incorporating all these factors into their decision-making process, and how does that play out at a macro level in terms of a disclosure enabling capital markets to more effectively allocate capital with an eye towards the long-term economic and public interest?
Simple, easy little question.
Exactly.
All right. From a macroeconomic perspective and a capital markets perspective, we have this idea that capital markets allocate capital in an efficient way. And that efficiency depends, the macroeconomic theory behind that depends on a lot of assumptions about kind of what those markets look like and how that's mediated. So to get that efficient market idea, the price has to convey a lot of the information, and you have to have entities coming into the market who kind of represent themselves and are able to act in the same way. We don't really have that. So what we have is a great asymmetry of information. We have very large entities, the corporations, and then we have investors kind of going with just the stock market price or just the financial disclosures within that. What the ESG information allows us to do is level that playing field a little bit. It also helps with that agent-owner problem. So managers of corporations are acting as agents for the owners, and we can't control those agents or we can't even oversee those agents if we don't really know what they're doing. So a lot of the ESG disclosure that we're working for, that we've been begging for, asking for, filing for decades now, is designed to give us as investors some information about how those managers are managing. So going back to the human capital example, one of the things we ask is how do managers' incentives tie to how well their workforce is trained? How do managers' incentives tie to how well the environmental management is going? How does managers' compensation relate to, pick anything, if the managers aren't being compensated for it, or if the incentive structure for the managers doesn't allow that, you're not going to get that activity. So it's incredibly important from an investor point of view to be able to get more information than simply ROE was 10% or the cash flows grew by 7%. That doesn't really help us. And the other important part is it's all a comparative game. So I can't compare what ExxonMobil is doing to what ConocoPhillips is doing to what Apache is doing if I have to go to each of them and ask for information separately, and Apache gives me information about how many wells it has and what the methane capture is, and Exxon gives me information about how many tankers it has, and, well, I'm unlikely to get that information from Exxon, but whatever information I can get from them. Right. If there is not a mandated disclosure, if the disclosure is voluntary and is only what we can extract from them, there is no comparability to it. So you're hampering the efficiency of a market. You're hampering the ability of that pricing in the market to do any kind of an efficient job in capital allocation.
That's incredible. I mean, we think of the SEC as focused on investor protection, and this absolutely is an investor protection issue. But the SEC also has mandates to focus on fair and efficient markets and capital,
right.
Formation. And these, what you're really saying is these issues hit those mandates squarely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I'm going to turn to Morris. I'm going to come back to Cindy for a second, but I'd like to turn to Morris because Cheryl mentioned this agent-owner problem. And one of the challenges that was also mentioned early on was that executives will manage to what they can measure. So I'd like to hear if you can speak a little bit about your experience as a top business executive on Wall Street, about how disclosure affects the decisions that executives make. Are they more likely to manage to what they can measure and report to investors? And maybe we can talk a little bit more about a couple of specific examples and drill down. But I'll let you start with that big, broad question.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. Yes, of course, managers have to manage to what they measure because they can't manage to what they don't measure. No manager can know everything that's going on with all of his clients, all of his customers. So he manages by reports of what's going on. And there's lots of specific examples. I'm, for instance, invested in Starbucks. I love Starbucks. I got my wife the Latte Day for Life card, for God's sakes. Okay, and I'm not going to tell you what that cost. But they, and working in London, there's Starbucks all over the place, just like there are in K Street here in Washington, D.C., and on Park Avenue where I live in New York. But somebody found out one day, because the United Kingdom has more aggressive legislators than we do here in the United States, that they weren't paying any tax at all in the United Kingdom. All of their revenue was offset by expenses in Liechtenstein and the Republic of Ireland, and fees for using the logos that were paid to affiliates in other countries. And they thought that was kind of bad. A member of the UK government called for a boycott of Starbucks. I might have liked to know that if I was a shareholder. I might have liked to know, how much revenue are you earning in this country and how much taxes are you paying in this country? And I could look at that and say, this looks kind of odd, a major country with lots of revenue but no taxes being paid. That's something that might have made a difference. I might have said, if that becomes public, that could cause calls for boycotts of your product in a big Western European country. That might not be something good for your stock price. That's something that a reasonable investor might want to know. It's not like questioning John Stumpf and asking if he's wearing boxers or briefs or something. Sure, an owner might want to know anything. But it's not just because you're an owner you have a right to ask anything you want. It's because you're an investor, you have a right and, in fact, a duty. If you're a fiduciary investing other people's money, as most decision makers are, you have a duty to understand things that your company's doing that's taking a risk that might affect the value of that company. So sure, yes, managers have to manage those things.
Absolutely. How should we think about things like political spending disclosure? And Senator Merkley mentioned that it's easy these days. Well, it's not always easy to sell the stock because you don't necessarily know what's going on. So partly the disclosure is key for being able to make those decisions if you want to buy or sell. But so many investors these days are invested in broad-based index funds, passive investment. They largely don't have a choice in what they buy or sell. How does that affect our way of thinking about investor knowledge, investor engagement, and executives, our ability to have disclosure align executives with those underlying interests?
Well, there's always going to be some companies that are not doing things. Some investors are not passive. If all investors were passive, then there'd be a huge opportunity for the last one who's not a passive investor. So I don't think that's going to be the end of active investing. But I think it's very important that investors do want to look at political spending. Just for instance, besides the Patriotic Millionaires, I'm also involved in the Center for Political Accountability. And they've published some reports showing us that there were companies manufacturing contraceptives that were donating money to lawmakers who were trying to ban their products in certain states. Now, that might be considered something reasonable. An investor might want to know, are the executives of the company trying to support politicians who are trying to ban the company's main product in their states? Yeah, that could be an interesting piece of information to an owner of the company.
Fascinating. I'd like to turn to Cindy, and Cindy, certainly you've written that groundbreaking article in 1999 that went all the way back to the 70s and the SEC's work on these issues, and environmental, social, and governance issues. And back in the 1970s, the SEC rejected expanding environmental disclosures on the grounds that, well, ethical investors make up an insignificant percentage of total shareholders, and therefore there just isn't enough investor demand. Now, we've certainly heard that $6 trillion are now one out of every six investment dollars is in an ESG oriented investment, and at $60 trillion of assets under management, those managers signed up for sustainable investing. But we also know that there's so many aspects of these issues we've heard today that are not just about the ethical investor. How should we be thinking about the SEC's current approach to disclosure? What's missing and why? What the authorities they have or the mandates that they might have to do more? And isn't it the case that they have to disclose all material information already? Why are these things not being disclosed today?
Andy is like a first-year law student. They're so enthusiastic. They ask 5 questions, each one of which would go, 5 minutes. So,
excellent, excellent.
All right, the SEC's authority, as it recognizes, is to require disclosure, quote, and this is its statutory authority under both the 33 Act and the 34 Act, as, quote, necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors.
Why is that or? Is that or word important?
That or word is always important.
I think I get to play, Socratic method here. Is that or word important? Why is that or word important?
The or word is important because it is not only disclosure for the protection of investors. It's either necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors. The SEC has taken the position in more recent decades that its mandate is to protect investors, but its mandate is broader than that. And the public interest mandate of the SEC goes to capital allocation, right? That we do not just look at the stock market as an important way for investors to save for their retirement or to save for the college educations of their children. We also think of it as a very important mechanism for the society's capital to be allocated towards future-looking, proactive management and industries.
So this public interest mandate, it's not unlimited. It's not like the SEC could go around and start telling, mandating how many ounces of mercury are in your water or something like that. It's related to something. It's related to capital allocation.
Right.
You're saying.
Right. So they couldn't tell. I like to say it's not an unfettered public interest mandate. They couldn't say to the automobile industry participants, you must have 35 miles per gallon for your fleets by 5 years from now. But what they could say is disclose in your annual 10K what your average mile per gallon is for your 5 different categories within your fleet. And then if everyone in the industry has to disclose these very clear facts, not boilerplate, then Cheryl and others and BlackRock can compare and determine who they think really is doing a better job.
So what are the tools that are available right now for the SEC? I mean, they've got this broad authority. There's no question about this authority, is there? I mean, we're not running up against a First Amendment challenge where people saying, oh, you're forcing us to disclose, bad things or whatnot. Maybe you might address that if you want to. But what are the tools that are available? So I'd love to hear if you have thoughts on the First Amendment challenge, but also love to hear about the toolkit at the SEC, because there are multiple ways for the SEC to do this, if I understand correctly. There's what are called line items disclosures. That's everybody's got to disclose this across the board. There's MD&A, management discussion analysis. That is the idea is put yourselves in the shoes of the management. How would you see the company? How does management look at the company? And certainly there are other types of disclosures as well in the proxy context. There are industry guides. What are the tools that are available, and how do they differ in terms of how we approach these issues?
Well, I think you've done a very good job of summarizing what the tools are. Line item disclosure, MD&A disclosure, schedules of disclosure for the proxy statement. And I think that what that goes to is thinking maybe what we're seeing and what the SEC is doing now is that it might be considering new tools. Right. So, for instance, many of the voluntary sustainability disclosure frameworks are going towards industry-specific disclosure frameworks. Right. So the SEC could have, differentiated disclosure obligations industry by industry. I think it could have an ESG schedule that it promulgates. Its rules and its schedules are law, and the ESG schedule could require an annual report that would have some across-the-board disclosure. What is your due diligence on human rights in the 10 countries where you have the most significant supply relationships, for instance. Mm-hmm. So there could be a range of across-the-board disclosure within this ESG schedule that are relevant to every company, and then industry-specific. So the SEC does some of that. It already does some differentiated disclosure, small companies versus larger, small, typically defined as $75 million revenue and lower than that.
Help me understand a little bit more, and I'm going to stay here because we need to go through some of these legal things to be able to move on back to the bigger questions. How does this question of materiality play in? I think for those of you who follow this issue, you often hear the word materiality thrown around. Material to whom? I thought material was an item. Like what is this word materiality? How is it used? How is it misused? And is it different or somehow more, do line item disclosures versus an MD&A change the way we think about the utility of it? So let me just start with that.
Okay.
What is it?
Materiality has been defined by the U.S. Supreme Court as information that a reasonable investor is significantly likely to consider significant, again, in the total mix of information available about a company.
That was complicated. Say that again.
Well, okay, first of all, this is the materiality of currently existing facts or historical facts, such as what are your earnings per share, is information that in the total mix of information already available, a reasonable investor would consider significant. So, for instance, if it's an omission, for instance, right, would having communicated that information have significantly affected the total mix of information available. It doesn't have to completely change the total mix, but a reasonable investor would consider it significant in essence. Now, for information that is forward-looking, the U.S. Supreme Court has articulated a different definition, and that's the definition that we essentially see in the regulation that we refer to as MD&A, Management Discussion and Analysis. Mm-hmm. And that definition of something that might happen in the future is when you're looking at a current known trend, event, or future contingency, what is the probability that this thing is going to happen or this trend is going to eventuate? What's the probability of its happening? And what would be the magnitude of the effect on your company? So looking at VW, right? At the time that VW knew that it had this, diesel cheating system in place, that is a known fact. So the management of VW would have to think, what magnitude of effect would, financial effect, would occur if this cheating became known, and what's the probability that the cheating would become known? Now, they had to assume that no one other than they would be testing their machines and, you know, discovering a discrepancy between what the diesel emissions actually were and what they were within the testing environment. And what has the effect been? They're stock down 50%?
But it's not strictly a numerical thing.
Right, exactly.
It has to be something that's material in the effect. Something could be tiny in terms of dollars, but still have a very material problem. For instance, if you're paying 0 taxes in a country, well, you're not paying any material taxes at all. So there's no material dollars
Right.
or euros in effect.
Right.
Or the political donations I was talking before were not material in terms of the financial effect on the company, in terms of the dollars they were spending. It was insignificant amounts in terms of the revenue and profits of the companies, but it was very material in terms of the effect on the future profits. So material, it's not just an economic term, it's not just a mathematical sense. It really means, is it important to the investor to know about? And it's something that has to be standardized. It's not even saving all the companies are voluntarily disclosing, and many more companies are voluntarily doing disclosures on political spending than had been in the past. That's not enough, though, because it has to be something that's the SEC requires to be in a standard way, so you can put them all on a spreadsheet and
Right.
compare them one by one by one by one and have your columns all lined up the same way.
I would also like to say that I think the SEC, it seems to me, has approached things from the perspective of the issuer deciding what's a material. And from the perspective of investors who are invested across a broad spectrum of the market, or even universal owners, the question is, how much can we diversify away from that? There's an element of materiality that is knowing what every company out there is doing. So how much are all of the companies, Volkswagen or anybody else, contributing to carbon emissions? So it's material for the investor who's not invested in Volkswagen as well. Another example, looking on the human capital area, is what are companies paying in wages, and how likely is it that if they're all dropping wages lower and lower and lower, that we're going to be paying larger taxes in order to support food stamps because they're not making enough to eat? Mm-hmm. That's material, and it's material in a broad way that Walmart might not think it's material, or Dollar Store might not think it's material. But I, as an investor, certainly think that's material because it's going to affect the entire environment that I'm looking at as I do things. Another example, just very quickly, is when you're looking at climate risk, Cambridge University did a study on can you diversify away from climate risk, and you can only diversify away from half of the climate risk that's out there. So no matter how hard you try, no matter what industries you try and hide in, you can only get to half. Well, that's pretty material for me as an investor to think that half of my returns are going to be affected by something I can do nothing about.
Wow, no, that's really incredible points. And it just goes to highlight how we have to be careful with the word material, because it's not necessarily material to the company. Mm-hmm. It's material to the investor. And the investor's decision-making process is going to be very different than how an executive might think about, well, what is this material to how I manage or whatnot, and those things. This is where the capital markets has to allocate and change the way the decision making happens. Did you have something to jump in on?
I wanted to support what Morris had said, and to put it into the terms that we use in securities law. Materiality has both a quantitative aspect and a qualitative aspect. And the quantitative is, financial materiality, but the qualitative aspect, which even the SEC around the time, of Sarbanes-Oxley, a few years before Sarbanes-Oxley, the SEC even recognized qualitative materiality goes to things like the integrity of management, the honesty of management. How likely is management of this company to follow the law? And so we really many of, I think everything that we've talked about in our multiple submissions in response to the concept release, these are things that are both quantitative and qualitative materiality.
If you hire a babysitter to take care of your kids one night, you and the babysitter might have completely different ideas about whether what she did with the $20 for dinner is material or not.
That's a great example. I want to ask Angela a question. So I think Cheryl really brought up the question of systemic risk in some ways, of these things are aggregated across sectors and you can't necessarily diversify away. But we also know that 70% of non-retired adults have retirement savings or pensions, much of which gets actively invested in the capital markets. And so for many Americans, especially the middle class, this is the majority of their interactions with the capital markets. And so how should we think about the role that ESG disclosures play in terms of affecting middle class wealth and retirement security?
Yeah, so I think, in talking about, SEC disclosures and thinking about this at the corporate level, it's kind of hard to see where this really comes down and hits the middle class. But I think there are really two important ways where it does. So to Cynthia's point about the SEC's responsibility both to the public interest and to investors, at the public interest level, there's this issue of, if they're, so using human capital as an example, focusing on the short term, focusing and not making long-term investments is a problem for productivity and is a problem for competitiveness writ large. So that affects middle-class workers because it affects the entire economy. And then there's a second issue where not only does it affect the economy in general, but the middle class is also, like Andy said, heavily invested in capital markets, whether it's through pension funds or retirement accounts. And so middle-class people are actually the investors who need this information as well. Those funds are acting on their behalf, and so it's important to have this information so investors can make key investment decisions that help grow those funds, that help make sure that middle-class Americans have access to a good retirement. So it doesn't really seem like it's a middle-class issue on its face. Certainly, I don't think that most of us walk around thinking like, gee, I wonder what the SEC is going to require as far as disclosures today. But it does really impact, our retirement.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'd like to turn to questions, actually. We have some time for questions, and if they're not questions, I've got some more questions that I can fill in. But Brendan, do we want to open the floor up to questions? We will, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will direct Brendan to bring the mic over. And if they're not, I've got a couple more questions.
Always a little shy at first.
This gentleman, lady right here. And if you could say your name and if you want to identify where you're coming from.
Yes, Jo Marie Griesgraber with New Rules for Global Finance and a proud member of the FACT Coalition. I was wondering how this work of the SEC relates to what states do, for example, with beneficial ownership and that kind of disclosure. And then on the international level, is the work toward legal entity identifier in any way a tool that can be used not only internationally but nationally?
You want to take the engagement question?
What states
yeah.
do? Yeah. Well, I'm not that aware of what individual states are doing. This work is federal because we're looking at the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is, as you know, a federal agency. The identifier, the company identifier information is a very important, particularly for the tax transparency work. Some of my colleagues were trying to do some identifying of parent-subsidiary relationships around the world, and it is very difficult to identify companies' subsidiaries around the world, which during the financial crisis was brought up when Lehman declared bankruptcy.
The financial system was designed that way.
If you, Morris, would you like to comment? I mean, the report, the joint report, talks about derivatives disclosures and financial stability disclosures.
The Office of Financial Research was created because of that exact problem. And I mean, I don't know if they've exactly solved the problem. I think they could have done a much more aggressive job than they actually have done.
But just to make sure the audience fully understands, we're talking about the LEI, or legal entity identifier. This is a numeric number that is assigned to every single legal entity, a corporation basically. And this enables you to create a chart or a schematic that says, all right, Lehman Brothers International Holding Company owns Lehman Brothers UK, owns Lehman Brothers Liechtenstein, owns Lehman Brothers USA. And then you could start to map out, well, there's a derivative, there's a swap between London and Liechtenstein, London and Singapore, New York and Hong Kong, or whatnot. You can also start to potentially identify which entities are paying the appropriate amounts of tax. And without that, you're flying blind as to where money is wrapped up, where it's tied up, and you could end up in a situation like AIG, which had a lot of money tied up in its state insurance subsidiaries that could not come up to the parent, and folks didn't realize those relationships. Similarly, with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, you had money tied up in surprising places. Let's move on to the next question. This gentleman right here.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Amol Mehra, and I'm the director of ICAR. We're co-sponsoring the event. It strikes me with the sort of wall behind you, one of the big words there is action. And I'm sort of curious to the panelists, how do we move beyond a conversation about the need for ESG disclosure into acting upon it? And Professor Williams, directly to you, on this point about investor protection or the public interest, is there a need for us to educate on the latter part of that sentence? And what sort of steps do you think that groups in this room and others could be doing on that point? Thank you.
I'm happy to start.
Action,
yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a couple of things. So first off, as you said, you're part of this coalition, so I think that organizing in some way to demonstrate that there's some actual will behind this is important. And then I think the second thing is making the business case for this. So, like for instance, in our report, we really try to focus on what would this disclosure mean for investors, and really trying to demonstrate that it was important, that it was something that was material, and is actually a key predictor of future economic growth. So I think to the extent that we can continue to partner and push on the SEC, and also to really make a compelling case that this is, as Ty said, to open it up, this is really about money. So it's not like, oh, we should do this because it's really nice to think about workers. Like, no, we should do this because this will help investors and this will help companies grow as well.
That's the case you have to
Cindy,
make to the commissioners.
Morris, would you say that the 1.2 million investors who weighed in favor of political spending was a powerful way of taking action?
I honestly don't know, because it's not a matter of convincing us in this room. It's a matter of convincing one person who's on the other side of the Capitol building at the SEC.
Maybe three.
And, well, maybe three, but I think at least a couple of them are already convinced.
Yeah.
So, there's one or two people that we have to convince. And do those one or two people care about those 1.2 million investors? I honestly don't know the answer to that, Andy.
That's a very good point. That's where the personnel really do matter.
Well, the empirical evidence would suggest they don't care because they haven't done anything on the political
Well, I'd like to give them the benefit of doubt, maybe. I don't know, maybe they care, or maybe they're going to care.
Okay,
or,
well,
I don't know. But I agree with you.
Yeah, to give the SEC the benefit of the doubt, they have had a lot of disclosure requirements, put on them by Congress in the last, 10 years, and particularly in Dodd-Frank. There were 97 rules, and those are only the explicit rules that the Dodd-Frank required the SEC to promulgate. So that's a lot of rulemaking, and the SEC gets sued whenever they promulgate a rule that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't like. Right? And they've had some very nasty decisions by the D.C. Court of Appeals.
That's one thing to keep in mind, is the other side has is much more paying attention, and is much more willing to hire lawyers and sue them and hire lobbyists and make their case both in the halls of Congress and the halls of SEC. And so we, on our side, if you're on a different side than the other side, have to make the effort to make that case.
I'd like to say that I think there is a really powerful rule for organizations like US SIF that Trillium's a member with, and I was formerly board chair for, and for Ceres, and for investor letters seem to be very helpful in certainly in providing protection. We've been involved in investor letters before the EPA, and the EPA said, oh, thank God you came. You know, it shows that somebody cares about this. That's a way to push back. And I think for the SEC, you know, going to the SEC and saying, no, there are people who care about this, and we're big and we're loud and we're as strong as we can be. And I think we need to learn to make a whole lot more noise.
Right. No, it's a combination. Other questions? This gentleman right here.
Hi, Rich Filato from the 50/50 Climate Project, and for my sins, I spent 5 years working on disclosure issues at the SEC. The discussions you've had is wonderful. I hope that this kind of discussion could actually happen before the Council of Institutional Investors to do some education there. Some interesting point to explore, though, might be the relationship between fiduciary duty and materiality in terms of management of portfolios. And the SEC, certainly in recent history, has been very weak around fiduciary duty issues, unlike the DOL. But if you look at, particularly for large institutional investors, and you ascribe where the majority of the returns come from that pay beneficiaries, it comes from the allocation from their asset allocation related to sort of beta types of issues rather than individual, not to get too economically oriented, but rather than to individual company outperformance through alpha. So that if we're talking about systemic risk related to materiality issues, a fiduciary obligation to manage beta through disclosure portfolio-wide might be, you know, sort of a legal approach that could be taken. That might be worthwhile in terms of either academic studies or in terms of regulation or even, you know, legal action.
I
really might want to comment.
You know, I'd like to
that.
hear Cindy's comment. I also have a follow-up question for Cynthia.
So are you suggesting that this would be a disclosure obligation on asset managers, or such as mutual funds or institutional investors?
Asset managers should be required to actually look at this type of materiality, because the return to the investor is not based on they're doing tremendous stock picking, but in terms of how they allocate risk throughout their portfolio.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And as you very well know, the fact that mutual funds today have to disclose how they are voting on shareholder proposals, for instance, came about through the AFL-CIO bringing a rulemaking petition to the SEC. So, you know, the public, have the power to bring petitions to the SEC, and certainly an SEC petition that suggests a broader concept of fiduciary duty and possibly disclosure by mutual funds again or other institutional investors is well worth exploring.
You know, a concrete example is what is the risk of carbon exposure within portfolios to the millennial generation that's invested through 401ks?
Yeah. I'd like to follow up with Cheryl for a second, because this comment also reminds me a question I wanted to ask, which is, are we still in a world where this is kind of a derivative of the question I asked Cindy, but we're not just talking do-gooder investments here. We're talking about real underlying performance that matches, or in some cases outperforms, entities that don't take ESG into consideration. Is that fair to say?
That's absolutely true, and I think you see increasing evidence of we'll call them mainstream investors as opposed to the SEC's ethical investors back in the 1970s, or ESG-oriented investors, you see increasing evidence that that's being taken into account. So, for example, the CFA Institute is beginning to include in its curriculum the idea that you need to be looking at these ESG factors. You have organizations like Credit Suisse that has put out a couple of different papers, one on gender diversity, showing a higher return on many financial profitability metrics, as well as some evidence of increased return on a stock market performance basis. You have Alex Edmonds at the University of Pennsylvania putting out papers about 100 best companies to work for and a persistent return to having companies with good human capital. You have a variety of issues like that, and then you have the climate risk issues. If it behooves you as an investor to have some idea of what your carbon exposure is. If the price of oil is starting to show a tendency to decrease or increase by 50% to 100% within the space of a year. That's helpful to know as you're trying to figure out where your risk is.
Right. I mean, that's just, it goes again back to the basics of we need to enhance this disclosure. We need to not dial back this disclosure through narrowing definitions of materiality, whether it's done at the SEC or places like FASB.
Or even, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I
please.
just have to jump in.
Please.
Not just FASB, but even in terms of some of the people looking at sustainability. We need to be clear that materiality is not just what happens this quarter or next quarter, that materiality is what affects the overall environment and a very long-term perspective.
That's great. That's great. We have time, I think, for one more question. This gentleman here, maybe we'll sneak into.
Hi, my name is Dan Dudas. I run the Chamber Watch project, so thanks for the shout out about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a public citizen. I have a question sort of about the sort of long-term issue here that's in the title of the seminar. You know, it strikes me that when I hear some of these issues, like the issue about lack of investment in human capital, the issue about Starbucks not paying any tax in the UK, that these are issues where, you know, the manager thinks, okay, you know, my salary, my compensation depends upon what the stock does next quarter or this year. And so I'll make this sacrifice that over the long term, 5 years from now, my staff will be less well-trained and the company will be less productive, but it won't matter to me because I'll already have moved on to the next company and I'll have, you know, the stock will have done really well because we'll have spent less money and so our margin will be greater. Or the same thing on the taxes. Like they think, you know, it'll be years before some MP figures out that we're not paying taxes. So in the meantime, this is good for our stock price. So how do you sort of tackle that compensation aspect where you've got all of these managers who are thinking in this very short-term way, and so they don't want to make investments and also, you know, sort of pursue policies that are not going to create a scandal and a consumer backlash at some point in the future?
Before I turn to Morris, and definitely Cheryl jump in, I will highlight the report that the Center for American Progress put out called Long-Termism or Lemons, where we do walk through a number of strategies, particularly on the tax side, but also in the securities regulatory side that we think will help orient executives towards the long-term performance of the company. But certainly I think these issues are all absolutely relevant as well. Morris, Cheryl, do you want to comment?
I agree with the premise of the question. I think it's a big problem with a lot of American companies. And I mean, I don't think it's going to change in the immediate near future. I think a lot of investors are seeing the same thing you're seeing. And I agree that's a problem.
I would say that I would look at it as the agent owner type of question in that area, and just say that the developing area of institutional economics and behavioral economics recognizes that not everything in economic regulation or not everything in an economic center can be conveyed simply through price. That when you're dealing with issues across time, when you're dealing with issues that are dealing with the asymmetric information, that the disclosure is a good way to do this. There's no way that owners can manage managers without additional disclosure about what are their incentives, how are they compensated, and that allocation through time in particular is an issue that needs the disclosure is particularly useful discussing.
I'd also go back to that multitask problem that I mentioned at the beginning. Requiring increased disclosure will not necessarily, that'll help solve the multitask problem. It won't necessarily solve the long-termism problem. And like Andy said, we have a big paper that we put out last year that addresses the long-termism issue in a number of ways. But it does help to start to get to if managers are evaluated and they know they're going to be evaluated by investors on these sets of issues, they might be more, it creates an incentive for them to at least pay attention to it. It might not necessarily, they still face that short-termist pressure for sure, but it might actually just help alleviate that pressure a bit.
We're going to have to wrap, and I welcome the last person to come chat with us afterwards. But I want to just note 3 things. One, we live in data-driven markets where technology is more important than ever. So the ability for us to digest disclosure is more powerful than ever. So I think that maybe next time we'll get some computers up here who can crunch numbers and do some flashy, shiny things on the screen. I want to thank Senator Merkley for his tremendous remarks this morning. It was a real honor to have him here. I want to thank Tyler Galosh for remarks and for also the hard work on this joint report. That I encourage everyone to take and read. And I particularly want to, again, extend a thank you to the tremendous broad coalition of folks on the progressive, some on the conservative. There's a whole range of membership here. These are not by any means a non-diverse group. So again, the AFL-CIO, the Americans for Financial Reform series, the FACT Coalition, ICAR, International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, Public Citizen, Patriotic Millionaires, USIF. Again, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the panel. That's a wrap. Thank you.